Ferrari and F1 fantasy is going to be the death of me. G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we are going to go through my early team thoughts and team selection process for the Japanese Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. So let's quickly unpack everything from China and what that meant for the fantasy fallout for the upcoming race weekend. The biggest takeaway from the first sprint weekend of the season was the Ferrari disqualification. Although probably not the most popular lineup heading into the deadline, as well as at the conclusion of the race weekend, certainly the one on screen here proved to be, up until the announcement of the disqualifications for Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc, the most plentiful. And when that news was announced that both drivers were summoned to the stewards, it certainly made for a pretty grim sight for Ferrari owners, myself included. What looked like a red hot start to the season after a solid result in Australia and pretty good scoring sessions for not just Ferrari, but most of these guys on screen here, went pretty south pretty quickly with that disqualification. Ferrari were on track for 86 points for the weekend and a 106 point swing, if I'm not mistaken, or 89 points and a 106 point swing to put them down to minus 23 points was a pretty devastating blow on all accounts, particularly because the rest of the team had done so well across the board. Oscar, obviously a blockbuster weekend, his first win of 2025 after putting it on pole on Saturday. And then looking at the rest of the team, Lance Stroll, he's been in the top 10 in all three racing sessions this season. And then Ollie Behrman's 20 points. I mean, I was bringing him in with the expectation he'd probably rack up a few overtakes, but to come away with 20 and a 0.6 price bump was pretty unexpected. So pleased with that outcome. Hulkenberg obviously did enough to not DNF and get another $0.6 million increase. And Gabriel Bortoleto was just prepared to eat that price drop, as I wasn't wildcarding. And on paper, heading into the deadline, if you were there for the stream on Saturday, was agonizing over whether or not to go away from Gabriel Bortoleto and Ferrari and pivot into probably a more aggressive points-focused team with McLaren and Mercedes paired up with another kind of budget option in there, but opted against it and stuck with Ferrari and Mercedes. And as I said, you know, it would have been a spectacular weekend, but I think I've had, if I'm not mistaken, 5 out of the last 6 disqualifications in F1 fantasy, or 4 out of the last 5 disqualifications in F1 fantasy. And the upward adjustment to disqualifications this year is a questionable decision, to say the least. You know, I think the community overall has been pretty outspoken around the DNF and disqualification penalties. And I will admit, I probably got my rub of the green in Australia with only 2. I know some people had 4, maybe even 5 in some cases. But I think to go from, what was it, 89 or whatever it was, 80 something to minus 23, I think it kind of goes without saying that seems kind of bordering on insanity for a price or a point scoring adjustment, even if it is a disqualification. These kind of things, much like the DNFs and the fastest lap, driver of the day, which we'll get to, out of our hands. So yeah, it's been pretty frustrating, and particularly when these kind of decisions for my team, and I imagine other creators feel the same way, when they're in the limelight, it's easy to get scrutinized a bit more. So, you know, in reality, not a decision I'd change because it was the right one and the best one until that announcement was made, but still awfully frustrating and, you know, puts me on the back foot. You know, as I said, inside the top 100K after 2 weeks would have been a great start to the year, and now I'm sitting outside the top 400 and probably also down at least 0.6 million. I would have been at least 102.4 in team value. So pretty frustrating, pretty disappointed. Not much more I can say. Just kind of got to push on to the next race of the season. So yeah, obviously a few weekend notes to disseminate as well. Talked about the Ferrari disqualification. Devastating for my team, devastating for anyone that owned them. And you've also got to pour one or multiple out for people who use Limitless in China. I think the general consensus heading into the deadline was that it wasn't the right chip to use. When I did a poll on stream, I think we had 400 respondents. 50% weren't going to use any chips in China. About 40% were using Wildcard, and less than 10% were using Limitless. So although it still remains a powerful chip to use early in the year, just not sure it was the right weekend. And I've, as I said, sympathized with the people who had Leclerc, Hamilton and Ferrari, because it was extremely unfair. And I just don't think this kind of devastating and harsh penalties should actually be quite as significant as what they currently are. Onto some probably more optimistic takeaways. I think the biggest one for me has to be the fact that although Williams had a solid weekend on all accounts, certainly a bounce back compared to their 10 points in Australia with 26, not quite the production we were hoping for them. I know many people wildcarded into them for the weekend, and to be outscored by Haas and VCarb certainly makes the latter two teams much more compelling options moving forward. I think simply because of their price in the 8 millions becomes more of a budget-friendly option. And the way the Haas guys are going, a lot of people outspoken about how slow they have been, but the overtakes, the positions gained from DNFs, etc., certainly works and has worked into their favor. We'll go through a couple of Haas assets in just a second. I think kind of based on that, we're seeing people move towards Haas and VCarb and their assets as a result of how the pricing model is structured. The template's already becoming very apparent after 2 races. A lot of people pivoting into McLaren, if not there already, and a budget constructor. I think in a couple of races time, people will have enough to go Piastri, Antonelli, McLaren, and maybe a Williams or a VCarb or something like that. So I think the template's already very apparent, and simply just because of the price change model, the budget building, and the metrics that are in store on F1 Fantasy Tools. Again, I'm not entirely sure, please correct me if I'm wrong here, that these yardsticks for point scoring and price rises are 100% accurate, because we did see some unexpected changes and outcomes from the price adjustments for Albon, Antonelli, etc. over the weekend that aren't fully explained. Again, I'm probably not 100% caught up on why that was, but it seems to me that a lot of people have and will continue to target assets that are likely to see subsequent $0.6 million increases. You can see this on f1fantasytools.com/budget-builder. And Hulkenberg, Behrman, Stroll, Ocon, I think they're going to be the most popular assets in the B tier driver category heading into Japan, simply because they don't have all that much work to do to get another big bounce in price. So just kind of some food for thought there, and we'll obviously digest a bit more of what that means come the deadline in Japan. I think Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson, something to keep an eye on. Again, at the time of recording, there's nothing announced on a potential swap between the two RB family drivers. There's speculation that Tsunoda will be in the seat for Japan and Liam Lawson will take a step down to VCarb, or so it seems at the moment. What that means for F1 Fantasy, historically speaking at least, I wouldn't be surprised if we see Yuki Tsunoda's Red Bull driver card, should the change happen, swapped out, his VCarb's driver card removed entirely, and the inverse for Liam Lawson. So I think as a result of their driver cards being swapped out, the price changes will change accordingly as well. I think we'll probably see Yuki in the 16s, Liam down in the 8s to 9 millions, or probably equivalent or similar to what their counterpart's price is at the moment. A quick one on driver of the day. Not too stoked about that outcome, to be completely honest. I don't think, even though I wasn't on the right side of it and not many people were with Antonelli, a questionable outcome to say the least. I think the commentators and pundits were also quite surprised by that. I don't think it quite implicates them as much as the engaged F1 fantasy manager at the moment, but it is 10 points and something that a lot of people spoke about last year. Ricciardo getting it in Singapore. Again, an outcome that probably demonstrates it doesn't have a place in F1 fantasy. Certainly not with the pricing or the scoring, I should say, at that degree. 3 to 5 points seems fair, but 10, again, the swings in these unexpected outcomes, disqualifications, DNFs, driver of the day, even faster slap to a certain extent, I just think they all need to be reduced. And I've been crying out for it for many, many years now. And I think the community would also at some point like to see a similar change. But if you have any contrary opinions on those possible changes in future seasons, I'd be very interested to hear that in the comments below. Now, quickly on transfer targets and thoughts for the upcoming weekend, just want to go through a couple of Haas assets that have caught my eye the last couple of weeks. Let's start with Esteban Ocon. 8.1 million. He's had back-to-back price increases over the last 2 weeks. And I think at 26%, not overly high ownership. I think at his price becomes a good budget enabler to a certain extent. Spoken about the racecraft and experience of the Haas duo in preseason. I had Behrman on my watch list, and obviously his performance last weekend really showed through there. I think Ocon, another driver that steps into a car that, to be honest, definitely not the fastest on the grid, and questionable performance concerns were raised in Australia. I think the fact that they are going to start further from the back, Ocon was P19, if I'm not mistaken, in the sprint in China. So I think there's some room for flexibility around accommodating at least one, if not two, Haas guys in your team. I think just simply because they are going to qualify much further and pick up positions. And then throw in the fact that Ocon was able to get up to 5th, obviously on the back of the Ferrari double disqualification, helped his case and his points a little bit more. But being a beneficiary of that is never a bad thing if you're an owner of a driver in a reliable driver in a solid midfield car. So I think you can obviously see there the consistency from overtakes and positions gained to propel his score up to 24 over the weekend. And then on the Haas constructor, just quickly, kind of similar point of view here. I think a beacon of consistency, 2 very good drivers in a reliable car. I think the fact that, again, we saw from them last year, not a team that necessarily qualified the highest, but did have the racecraft and experience to move up the field. I think we're going to see a very similar situation emerge this time around with the new pairing of of Ocon and Behrman at Haas. So 14 and 8 for Haas and Ocon respectively in Australia is probably more representative of what I expect their score to be week. But I think obviously benefiting from the disqualifications of drivers ahead of them and the fact that they are able to extend their overtakes and opportunity to gain positions when those opportunities did present themselves in China was obviously a beacon of encouragement, I would say. So a good sign for these guys moving forward, and particularly for the constructor at 8.2 million. I do think it becomes a very good option, particularly on the price change front, which we will then get to again in a moment. So my early team thoughts for this week, probably not too much to talk about for me personally. I don't really see myself doing much with Oscar Piastri, Lance Stroll, Nico Hülkenberg, and Oliver Behrman. I say that because they are all on the up in terms of what a likely price increase looks for them in the next race. Bortoleto, certainly Ferrari, and maybe not Mercedes, but just simply because of their price, become the natural makeways for other assets to accommodate. Now, before I jump into my team selection opportunities, just will redirect you guys back to the budget building tab at F1 Fantasy Tools and what to obviously look out for. I have a budget building guide coming out very shortly. Rain Fantasy and Pop Pan Man have already done really good content around that. So I'll do my best to emulate some of the great work those two guys have done already in F1 Fantasy. But in terms of my targets for this week, as I said, looking at those guys that don't need a lot of points to increase in price, and I'll direct you in the B tier more towards Ocon, Stroll, Behrman, Hülkenberg, 3 of which I've already got in my team. Ocon the 4th, I'm weighing up. Unless they DNF, it's a high likelihood that they will go up in price again. Piastri doesn't need much to get even a $0.1 million increase at 8. But I do think unless these numbers do change before the deadline, which is possible because there's still a bit of uncertainty around the price change model, then we may well see these numbers tweaked. I think over to the right-hand side, McLaren and Mercedes, really high likelihood that nothing like this will happen. Although Ferrari, a 0.1, or I think it was a 1% chance of them going down 0.3 in price, still somehow made that happen with that double DQ. So for that reason, because they have to score 85 or 61, or as it stands at the moment, to get a price rise, they're an easy offload for me this week. And then looking at Haas and VCarb and even Williams, probably assets I'm very much entertaining heading into this week's F1 Fantasy or this race weekend's F1 Fantasy deadline. So I will swing over to my team on the screen here and just go through some potential builds off the bat, kind of haven't given it much thought because I think there's going to change. A lot's going to change between now and my final thoughts video. But the first obvious move to me would be to completely swap out the constructors, carrying 3 free transfers over from China, as I only made a Behrman for Hadjar swap at the deadline last weekend. So McLaren, Williams is probably one such adjustment. I could get in Bortoletto. I could get out Bortoletto. That leaves me 11.1 in the bank. My obvious target, again, feels like Esteban Ocon, just because, as I said, doesn't need a lot to increase in price. It leaves me 3 million on the side. I'm not super excited about carrying this kind of money into a race weekend just on the bench, but may just be an easy way to recover some of that value I lost out from Ferrari last weekend. The alternative to this constructor's situation, and may well think about taking a hit if there is some point and price gain upside, but not so sure at the moment, would be to pivot into either a VCARB or a Haas. Let's talk about Haas first, because let's start with Haas first, because we've just talked about them. Drop them in here alongside McLaren, and that gives me 16.4 million to play with. Going back to the budget building table, I think 7 points for Albon, although I would much rather prefer an asset with 0.6. I don't think 19's outside the realms of possibility for him. And to be honest, going back to the team on screen here, if I drop him in, he had 17 and he had 11. To get a price rise of 0.6, he needs 19 at the moment. So, God, I'm jumping around, aren't I? But I think that's certainly a possibility to go down this path, for example. I think one other option for me could be going the VCARB route. I was really impressed by Hadjar and Tsunoda, and just a shame things went awry, particularly for Tsunoda. That front wing capitulated under the pressure on the straight. 3.8, again, leaving a lot to chance here. But the one thing I will just say to keep in mind, I mentioned Tsunoda and Lawson before. Now, Lawson is currently 16.8 in the game as it stands. I have just fallen short to afford him or his equivalent. Let's say, hypothetically, Yuki Tsunoda comes in at 16.8. Now, there might be teams with more value than me built up over the last 2 weeks. I would love the opportunity to squeeze in Yuki Tsunoda if, for whatever reason, he came in under the 16.6 I've got available to use. I think he looks much more comfortable this season than he has in any prior season. And if we see a swap for Japan at a price that I can squeeze in, I'm looking at him instantly. If not, I'm not sure. I may again have to stick with Albon in this driver slot. And then, like I said, consider maybe making an upgrade elsewhere in the team. The problem is, as I've said before, with the budget building tab, just about everyone else below Albon needs to score pretty heftily to see another price jump. So, I thought about McLaren, Mercedes, but again, it does take a little bit of financial feng shui to make that work. Not to mention, obviously, the fact I'd be eating, if I went down this path, another 2 price drops. And after last weekend in China, I'm not sure I can afford that. So that's why I'm not quite eyeing off this particular build for this weekend. But I will be back with my final thoughts, going through all of my final decisions for my team. So I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. As always, let me know down how your team shook out after China and if you'll be running a similar lineup in Japan. But I'm going to leave it there, as I said, for now, guys. Thanks again for watching, as always, and I will see you all very soon.